You're live. We are live
Good,
right now.
good afternoon to everyone. Welcome to the Center for Biosecurity Studies webinar entitled Climate Change and Sustainable Development Series. Is the Road to Redemption Flooded with Risks? Part 1. I would like to invite Professor Lord to give an introduction to the webinar.
So good afternoon, colleagues, and thank you to the Center for Biosecurity Studies for organizing this series, the first in the Climate Change and Sustainable Development series. As Janice said, I'm the Dean of the Faculty of Social Sciences at UWA Cave Hill, and I'm happy to bring you greetings on behalf of the entire faculty. The faculty, a bit for the faculty, we are just over 50% of the number of undergraduate students and graduate students. We have a number of departments: economics, government sociology, social work, and psychology, department, Cave Hill School of Business and Management. As part of the faculty, we have the Sheila Framfel Center, affiliates, so our affiliates in social and economic studies, the Institute of Gender and Development Studies, and our newest, the Center for Biosecurity Studies, which is organizing this webinar series. We have Dr. Kurt Douglas, the director of that center. Not so new anymore. He's been here for 2 years, and so he's been doing an excellent job in terms of his work in biosecurity and in terms of his advocacy in relation to biosecurity studies. And again, as I said, we are delighted to be a part of this seminar series on climate change and sustainable development. Today we have a very esteemed panel that Janice will introduce to those who are following the seminar today. And we hope to have a really informative session. You will find that we have a diverse participant list who will bring different perspectives in relation to the topic before you. Some of these we believe may be linear, some of these will be outside the box, so to speak. But all in all, we expect to have a lovely afternoon. Well, afternoon where we are, and perhaps mornings where some of you are. But we hope to have a lovely afternoon interrogating, is the road to redemption flooded with risks? So back to you, Janice. Thank you.
Thank you. Our first presenter is Ms. Catherine Adong, the transport planner and engineer from Trinidad and Tobago. Her topic is road infrastructure, traffic, and climate change. Ms. Catherine Adong is a leading transportation planner and transportation engineer based in Trinidad and Tobago. She helps public and private sector organizations by applying techniques for analyzing and resolving traffic and transport problems. Ms. Adong is a graduate of Edinburgh Napier University, where she attained a master's degree in transport planning and engineering. She is a chartered transport planning professional UK, and she was the first woman in Wales to do so in 2007. She is also a fellow of the Chartered Institution of Highways and Transportation in the UK. She's a graduate of the University of the West Indies with an honors degree, double majoring in geography and geology. Ms. Adong has worked for over 20 years in the transportation planning and transportation engineering sector. After a successful career in UK, being employed at major global consultancies, helping private sector clients, example, land developers, estate managers, universities, construction firms, hospitals, and the public sector clients such as government organizations and local authorities. Ms. Agong is now a research assistant in the University of the West Indies Department of Civil and Engineering and PhD researcher in the field of shared mobility, informal transit in the urban environment, with a keen interest on how transport policies affects women, health, and persons with disabilities. Mr. Gong enjoys voluntary and advocacy work for persons with disabilities and specific disenfranchised communities, and she also enjoys the art of decorative design. Mr. Gong, we await your presentation, Road Infrastructure, Traffic, and Climate Change.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Ms. Brown, and I'd like to say a formal thank you to Dr. Douglas for inviting me to speak today. So the question is the road to redemption flooded with risks? Right, so my presentation today, I'll briefly demonstrate the overlap between biosecurity and transportation planning and transportation engineering. I would also look at how the transportation system is vulnerable to climate change, and hopefully to show that transportation planning and transportation engineering have a role in biosecurity. At the end, I'd suggest some solutions to cope with the climate change impacts. First, I get into some definitions. I'm not sure what the makeup of the audience is, so I thought I would start off with some definitions to set the foundation for my very short presentation today. Firstly, a definition for transport planning. It's a methodological process of preparing physical facilities and services of all modes for future transportation needs. What we do is assess and try to predict what's happening in the future with regards to population growth, population changes, and so forth, and come up with physical plans and facilities and services to meet the transportation needs that we predict will be in existence in the future. To do that and to facilitate that, we produce transport policies and transport plans, and these account for every part of our lives and livelihoods in order to cope with the future changes and development. Another definition is mode of transport, because that was used in the definition of transport planning. And I must say transport planning and transportation planning are phrases that are used interchangeably depending on which jurisdiction you work in. So for us here in the Caribbean and in North America, they use transportation planning. In Europe and UK and places like that, they say transport planning, but it means the same thing, and same for other phrases that I'll come across in this presentation. But modes of transport mean walking, cycling, bus, train, plane, riverboat, car, truck, etc. It's just the way that is the method of movement. Transportation engineering or transport engineering deals with planning, design, and operation of various transportation systems and their components for safe, efficient, convenient, and economical movement of persons and goods. So the transportation engineer basically takes the plans that the transportation planner would develop for future transportation needs, and then plans and designs things like parts of the transportation, such as the travelways, for example, the highways, railways, waterways, cycleways, pavements, the terminals, such as airports, railway stations, bus stations, and the carriers, the cars, trains, buses, bicycles, ships, for example. So hopefully that's given you a foundation of what these two things are and the difference between the two. Most of the time, people like myself end up straddling both transport planning and transportation engineering. Sustainable transport is transport that minimizes the adverse impact on the environment and society. So sustainable transport is concerned with low or no emission movement, as well as healthy transport. Healthy transport is quite a buzzword these days, and it means the same thing more or less as active travel, meaning walking and cycling. In other parts of the world, they use scooters and other things like that as well. Basically using your body to power your transport. Sustainable transport also includes mass transportation, which could be privately provided, such as shuttles provided by universities or hospitals, and as well as mass public transport, such as bus rapid transport or railways. And the interchange or the relationship between transport and sustainable development was first sort of outlined in Agenda 21, which was done in the 90s, I believe 92 or 93. Climate change risks to sustainable transport. I have identified for the purpose of this presentation 3 areas which I think present risks to sustainable transport and thus sustainable development, i.e. excessive rainfall, which results in flooding, as well as threats from displaced animals such as caiman and capybara. Recently, we've had some very, very bad weather in Trinidad. I'm actually based in Trinidad. And so caiman, which are those big alligator, crocodile type animals, have found themselves in urban areas. Capybara, that massive rodent, which I'll show you a photo of later. Last week, one found itself in the city center outside a bank. And it is said by some ecologists or the other that flooding, excess flooding in South America and Trinidad is pushing them away from where they would normally have their habitat. I think I understand people are breeding them as well. So who knows how this capybara ended up in the city center. The other climate change risk I see is the public health threat, which was brought to light, of course, with the recent COVID-19 pandemic. Transportation planners, there's no transportation planner alive on earth at the moment, I could safely say, who has had to deal with public health threats to transport. So it's very new and very emerging, and some studies are coming out in relation to that. The other threat is extreme heat. I'm not sure what's happening in Barbados or in other parts of the world that the participants might be based, but it's definitely feeling a lot hotter than I remember. So this is the capybara that was found in downtown Port of Spain. Port of Spain is the capital of Trinidad and Tobago. And you can see this article is from the 15th of September. So that would have been last week. And some members of the public had to catch this capybara. And I'll go into more details of why climate change forcing animals out of their habitat into urban areas where people walk and drive and so forth is a threat to sustainable development. The capybara is fine. It was released in a bird sanctuary, and it was checked over and everything's fine with the capybara, in case anybody wanted to know. Right, so the impacts of climate change on transport, as I've mentioned, flooding, public health, and high temperatures. So I'll delve into this a little bit deeper now, quickly for you all. Flooding obviously causes travel delays for all modes of transport. For example, walking through flood water is very dangerous. It's a big no-no. Our disaster management organization here stresses every rainy season how dangerous it is to walk through flood water because of the diseases, the threats from animals such as caiman and snakes. One was actually killed recently, unfortunately, because people were so scared it ended up in a built-up area. As well as safety threats, like I mentioned, being washed away or falling into a drain or river, something like that, whilst walking. Personal car, the private car, experiences a lot of traffic congestion due to delays caused by navigating floodwaters or having to stop driving completely because of flooding. And public transport here in Trinidad, there's a lot of privately provided public transport by taxis and what we call maxis, which are small 25-seater buses. Private operators more often than not cease service whenever they hear there's flooding. They might not experience it, but you know, with WhatsApp groups and everything, they hear that there's flooding somewhere and they just decide to either go home or park up, or so people get stranded, including tourists. And an extension of the impact of that is on people's mental health and well-being. Imagine being stranded. It happened to me recently. I'll show you all a video soon. It happened to me recently, and I was that day using public transport, and I was completely stranded after the flood for more than an hour. And so that is, you know, impacts of flooding on transport. Where public health is concerned, like I said earlier, this is a new challenge for transportation planners and transportation engineers. We haven't had a pandemic like this to deal with. We haven't had widespread public health threats. I mean, there has been epidemics in different parts of the world, and I'm not sure how they were dealt with regards to transport. But what happened with COVID-19 is that because of the need to maintain physical distancing, there was reduced capacity on most public transport vehicles. It started at half. So if a 25-seater maxi was operating, they could have only taken 12 people rather than 25 people. So that meant passengers had to wait longer to get their ride. And there was more of a shift from public transport to private car use, which we all know is one of the biggest contributors to climate change through emissions. An extension of that would have been reduced access to jobs, which would have had an adverse impact on the economy. Public health, though, this public health crisis, this pandemic, we saw lots of places in the world actually reported increased numbers of walking and cycling, which is good for healthy transport, and it's good for sustainable development as well. So I guess over the next year or so, we'll see what the trends are like, if people will go back to what they were doing before, or it has encouraged people to take up healthy transport and active travel. On the adverse impact of climate change as it results to higher temperatures, this is definitely a barrier to walking and cycling, especially where there's little shade. Built environment has been done more recently in such a way that shade hasn't been naturally provided by, you know, the buildings or planting of trees and things like that. And with it being so hot, people don't want to walk and cycle and get to work or wherever they are sweaty, and you know what that's like. So here is a video. It's very short. I just wanted to show you. This is downtown Port of Spain, a place called Independence Square. That building that you see opposite is the Treasury. And I was in this building here after meeting stranded. So as you can see, there's congestion in the road because of the flooding. And this was after maybe an hour of heavy rain. It's completely flooded. I took this video, so you'll hear a little bit of commentary at some point. You could see a man there walking through the flood water, which as we know is very dangerous. And there's some people, some ladies there walking across in the flood water, in their suits, trying to get back to their offices. So solutions. The question was, is the road to redemption flooded with risks? I think it is, but I think the solution is to mitigate the risk to reduce the vulnerabilities. And I'm going to here offer some ways of doing that. One, disaster management in transportation planning. So what I mean by that is to integrate disaster management within training and education in transportation planning. I mentioned before, my knowledge and training in disaster management is because my very first job was in disaster management. My very first job after I completed my first degree was in disaster management. And I really think now we're actually experiencing adverse impacts of climate change that we need to consider as disaster management within our transport planning and transportation engineering activities. Also, integrate transport planning within disaster management, meaning that disaster management plans ought to have more detailed transport plans within them. The design of infrastructure needs to be done in such a way to cope with flooding. And I think that flood risk assessments should be embedded into transport planning and transportation engineering, meaning transportation planners and engineers should be equipped to understand flood risk assessments and to assess how the outputs from flood risk assessments affect the design and the policies for transport. The design of transport operations needs to be done in such a way to cope with incidences of flooding before and after flooding, as well as public health challenges. There was a small amount of research done during the COVID-19 pandemic as operators tried to maintain their capacity on their services. And definitely that needs to be looked into with a bit more detail so that, you know, as these things happen more often, we'll be able to cope with them a bit better. Design of the built environment should be done in such a way that it provides shade, shelter, and safe places to wait when it's flooding. For example, shelter from extreme temperatures, as well as I think bathing and changing facilities should be commonplace in the work environment, as well as public spaces, which used to be a very, very long time ago. Probably have to go back to that in order to break down the barriers that people would have to cycling and walking, for example, and getting sweaty and getting dirty on their journeys to work. Maintenance and upgrade of infrastructure is definitely something that is needed and to be stressed upon to drainage engineers, because drainage often shares, a lot of the time shares the space with transport. Drainage shares space with pavements. Drainage sometimes is beside a pavement or underneath a pavement, under a road, bridge, so forth. So that overlap and that stress that it puts on the transportation system when the drainage isn't adequate to cope with the runoff means that we need to upgrade infrastructure and we need to look at designs and things like that so that we can cope with it better. Information and communication. I'm very big on information and communication. If you follow me on LinkedIn, you would see I post a lot of my musings and photos and videos that I might take as I go about my day-to-day business. I'm always observing what's happening with traffic and transport. And my disaster management experience, as well as my marketing and communication knowledge, tells me that we need to be better about how we communicate as it relates to disasters, flooding, weather, and the impact that it will have on transport, so that people will know what to do when you know, their normal way of traveling might be impacted by flooding, for example. And this all goes together to increase the resilience of the transportation system to climate change and the risks associated with that. In conclusion, I'll make a couple of statements. We need to manage the climate change risks to transportation to safeguard lives and livelihoods, as we cannot live and thrive in our households, in our towns, in our regions, in our countries without moving from place to place. We have to move. as humans in order to live. And therefore, we're here with these risks and these problems with climate. And therefore, we have to manage the risks in order to be able to safeguard our livelihoods, which I know is what biosecurity is all about. And I hope I've demonstrated that transportation planning, as well as transportation engineering, has a role in coping with the changing climate conditions. So that's the end of my presentation this afternoon. You can contact me on LinkedIn. Just put my name into the search box, and I think I'm still the only Catherine Agong on LinkedIn, but you'll see my photo there anyway. Send me a connection request. And you can email me at catherineagong@gmail.com. And I was just wondering if you would mind answering my poll. I'll post it in the chat. Would you be interested at all in a transport TikTok? It's all very new and people are encouraging me to do it. And I just want to know what people here think. So thank you all for listening. I will post the link in the chat, and I'd be really happy if you were to answer that poll. It's just a yes or no question. Thank you so much for your time.
Thanks very much, Mr. Gong, for your presentation. It was very enlightening, especially as you took the time to define the different terms. That was very informative, so that it sets the basis and the foundation as we go ahead looking at sustainable development. Are you in a position you'll be able to answer any questions?
Yes, I can
Dr.
answer
Douglas?
questions. Yes, I can answer
Okay.
questions.
Dr. Douglas, the question and answer segment for Mr. Gong.
Could you say that again, Ms. Brown?
No, Dr. Douglas is going to do the question and answer segment for you.
Okay.
Okay. Thank you very much, Mr. Gong. Extremely insightful presentation. Learning more about transport engineering and transport planning. I think within Barbados, within the last month or so since school has reopened, I think we can all attest to the services of transport planners and how we do need your services so badly to alleviate the traffic congestion that we encounter on mornings and around the school leaving time. There is one question in the question and answer box, and there are, I saw also in the chat, and this is just a reminder to participants to place your questions in the question and answer box rather than the chat. So this comes from Ms. Sherry Pounder. Hi, thanks for your presentation. Within your country's committees, have you found the willingness to invite other professionals in disaster management or hydrology to participate in transport planning and climate resilience when needed? So I guess the question is asking about the willingness to basically bring on board other professionals in disaster management or hydrology.
I'm not sure if the willingness is there or not, and it's not. Let me explain what I mean by that. The awareness isn't there, in my opinion. So a lot of people, the profession of in this jurisdiction in Trinidad and Tobago, the transportation planning and transportation engineering it's new. Although everybody thinks they are a transportation planner, everybody thinks they are a transportation engineer because, like I said, we all move. So everybody has an opinion on traffic and transport, but there's no formal, what's the word? There's no formal, help me. There's no formal integration between those disaster management profession and transportation planning. And I think it's something that I will add to my very long to-do list. I'm very pleased that Ms. Brown and yourself reported that the definitions I presented to begin with were insightful. And that's what I tried to do with my LinkedIn, so that people become aware So no, the answer is no. But I don't think that there's a lack of willing. I think the lack of awareness, if there was an awareness, then I could answer whether there's a lack of willingness or not, if you see what I mean. So thank you for that question.
Yeah, no problem. And I think that's where I see, in my opinion, where biosecurity comes in, where we can show people how to connect the dots between seemingly disparate disciplines and sectors, but really all integrated into common problems and challenges. There's another question here about what about increased incidence of transport breakdown as a result of increased temperature? Many types of transport can overheat. Also, tires will deteriorate more quickly. So I guess the person is asking in terms of the negative impacts of excessive heat as it relates to the performance of vehicular transport across the Caribbean and how that all works.
That is outside my area of expertise, because what I understand, can you hear me?
Now we can.
Okay, yeah, we have some thunder here, very bad weather today. That is of the vehicles, and the performance of the vehicles are outside of my area of expertise. So I'm not sure, I can't answer that question if heat affects the performance of the vehicles. I'm thinking after a certain age, it might, I'm thinking, just because of breakdown of parts and things like that, but I'm not sure, actually. I don't know.
Okay. Well, I see there's more questions there. What I will do, I will share these questions with Ms. Gong, because I know she has to leave, and we want to get to the next presenter as well. And I know Ms. Gong will also be committed to answering these questions. And who knows, we may actually be developing something a bit more formal as it relates to training, as it relates to education in this particular field. So you can stay tuned to that. So thank you very much, Mr. Gong. As I said, this is something that is novel for me, and I think for a lot of other persons who are joining on the call. And we really thank you for sharing and imparting on us the information that you would have shared. So thanks once again.
Thanks so much for inviting me. I look forward to the questions. I enjoy this kind of presentation. And yes, I do have to leave from my laptop, but I'll join on my phone. So while I'm on the move, I'll be listening to everybody else's presentations and questions as well. Thank you so much.
Thank you too.
Thank you.
Back over to you, Janice.
Our next presentation would be by Mr. Charles Yearwood. His topic is climate change, drainage, and flood risk in Barbados. Mr. Yearwood is a senior technical officer in the Ministry of Transport, Work, and Water Resources in Barbados. He heads the Drainage Division, which has responsibilities for stormwater management in the island. His principal role is to lead efforts in flood mitigation, maintenance of all drainage structures, drainage assessments on proposed physical planning development, and implementing recommendations of drainage studies. Mr. Yearwood has an honors degree in physical planning and environmental resource development from the University of Technology, Jamaica. He is also a graduate of the University of the West Indies, where he read for a master's degree in project management and evaluation. He has a certificate in water management from Dresden University of Technology and a recipient of a Japanese fellowship, where he completed a certificate in river and dam engineering at the Japan Public Works Research Institute. Mr. Yearwood started his career as a draftsman in architecture and technical assistance in Bridgetown traffic management and the South and West Coast sewage studies. He has 27 years in stormwater management. His research interest is of flood mitigation and physical environmental issues. He has attended workshops, seminars, and conferences in the Caribbean, Latin America, USA, Europe, and Asia, and presented papers at some. He's a stickler for detail, has a passion for environmental photography, and loves woodwork and gardening. Mr. Yearwood, we're looking forward to your presentation on climate change, drainage, and flood risk in Barbados.
Good afternoon. Sorry, Mr. Yearwood, I think you're still muted, but just before you get started, I just want to encourage the participants to complete the poll, the first poll that we have up. Some of you have already started, but we just want to make sure that all the other persons have done that as well. And Mr. Yearwood, yes, you're unmuted now. I guess you can start to share your screen. Or is it, Janice, are you going to be?
Janice,
Yeah, Janice, you can share his presentation and you can change the slides for him as well. Sorry about that.
Mr. Yearwood, you may go ahead. My apologies.
okay, thank you. Right. Thanks again. Good afternoon, everyone, presenters and those joining in the chat participants. We at Public Works are happy to be involved in your webinar on biosecurity. The presentation will attempt to look at the flood in Barbados and to look at the perspective from biosecurity. First, we describe some flood conditions, characteristics of flooding. We will focus then look at the activities, cultural practices used related to flood. I'll then separate them, classify them into different responses of the what we consider drainage concerns and biosecurity, and then look to how we can mitigate them. So, in the context of the conditions of flooding, once you start to attend primary school and tropical in the Caribbean, you experience flooding. From a very young age, times that predate your memory at times, you experience flooding. But the landform dictates the type of flooding or flooding itself, the incidence of flooding. The functions of flooding has to do with the rain intensity, how much rain is falling within a specific period, the duration, the catchment characteristics. Is it a large watershed? Is the watercourse slope high or flat? Is it coming from a very high elevation to a very short run to the coast? We're in island states, so every drop of rain, there's an excess of infiltration or that flow on the earth, then finds itself to the outfall into the sea. We have river and flooding. flooding constrained within the watercourses and sometimes man-made channels. And of course, we need to have different land uses to spur economic growth. We start from housing, to tourism, to industry, to civic buildings and the like. So you have development pressures. And particularly private sector, there's that need, particularly in urban areas, to maximize every square meter of lands to have a return on investment. Then we have inadequate drainage systems. In the Caribbean, many islands in modern, well, say from settlement, has been around from the 17th century. And we have drainage systems in excess of 100 years old, 200 years old. Indeed, particularly in the military installations, you'll find those drainage systems are as old as the military stations themselves, which goes back to the 1700s. And then you have tidal influences, where you have wind as the energy generator. Once you get winds across the ocean, it whips up the waves and it throws it onto the land. You get those tidal influxes. Next slide. So then we have what we consider in the context of Barbados, flood characterization. We speak in terms of categorizing floods in two levels: nuisance flood hazards and major flood hazards. The nuisance flood hazards, predominantly those floods in which we have water is not exceeding 300 millimeters or 12 inches of flood height or flood depth. And these are predominantly in small watersheds. They're shallow flood depths, I said, in not no more than 300 mil of water, but sometimes the expanse, depending on how flat the areas are, they can be for an acre or so of land. They're minor to moderate damages, and the damage to the house, damage to property, cars, and the like, gardens. And then we have, they require very low level, low rank of flood proofing. And the converse is really on major flood hazards, where you have large watersheds. And in the case of Barbados, you have the Constitution River and the Bruceville Valley. Then you have high peak flow, high velocities, and the flood depths in excess of 300, and some go to 4 meters, 5 meters. In the riverine conditions, but they're very close to roads, because then we have, Mr. Gong speak about transportation, where a watercourse, a road across a watercourse, you have a bridge or culvert, and in some of the cases you have narrowing up the bridge. They reduce the span, but the slight height can get in excess of 5 meters. Is within the access to road users, and so we consider even riverine flooding within the regions of bridge and culverts to be part of flooding infrastructure. Then we have risk to human life because of the depths, and there are significant economic losses, and there are major flood works required. Next. Go ahead. One of the concerns in terms of flooding, people look for flooding in terms of waters, but in terms of biosecurity, we drill down in terms of what happens to flood routine maintenance. Here we have persons who's cleaning normal sized drain. There's a water course at the back of it. But look at the activities around it. Not much to water. There's no water. But some person is maintaining and cleaning the grass from the drain, the concrete swale. There's some we'll say garages at the back, and we'll come to that to speak to that earlier. But the two persons cleaning are cleaning with gloves and boots. Recently, prior to climate change, no one wore masks. You see in Asia, when persons have influenza, a common cold, they use it. But this is a practice that is beneficial to biosecurity concerns. Next. We know earlier tidal influences. Once you have climate change, people speak of sea level rise. But some of the lands on the coast are very flat. In the case of Barbados, most of our flatlands, the west and south coast, where predominantly a number of our physical infrastructure and population exist and reside. And there are narrow outfalls or drains that convey the water from upstream to the sea. As the island state, I said earlier, there are some areas in the island where you have a valley within inland, and those waters don't get to the sea. And there are few, but most of the lands on the island drain towards an outfall. Along the south and west coast of Barbados, in excess of 80 outfalls. And so you sometimes have to create a picture on the right, a sluice gate to control the movement of sand up the drain. And sometimes you have to know where to control that height, because the traditional methods of taking it by hand, in this case, this is at the end of a swarm. An estuary providing fisheries development prior to urbanization is constrained by a drain, but the color of the water is by the tannin of the mangroves and not by some other physical coliform or industrial waste. Next slide. We have urban flooding, and if you put on then the biosafety hat, the picture to the top left, you see a garbage disposal, a container. It's full or it fell some way, but this garbage in the bag exposed to water, flood waters. You have the pump house in the back, which the water, this low depressed area to an outfall, probably half a kilometer away. There's a house set up right close there. So that, of course, is a concern. The extreme right, there is an urban area, and in urban economics, we're talking about having excess labor within the urban centers. But they find settlement where the lands are of the lowest value and obviously with a high flood potential. And the division sought to create a retention pond away from within its area, but it's standing waters for a while. Prior to the construction of the depression, you had inundation in and around the houses. And because, again, it's a depressed area, there was no central, it's not linked to a central sewage system. And so you have pit latrines and associated issues we come to later. In the middle of the bottom, then you have a channel, and you have to erect a grating to take the debris or strain the debris away in the urban waste from a pump house that otherwise can impact the operations of the pumps. And this is a constant exercise. The indiscriminate dumping of waste and garbage and the plastics as well is a concern. And at the bottom left, you have a vehicle and vehicles being stranded within a flooded area. Next. So what I tend to do to look at this is really to then look at flood challenges on biosecurity concerns. In this way, the approach is to look at a list of what we consider, and this ones they consider flood contributors, those things that man mean human beings here, man and woman, children, activities on the land, on the canvas of the land that contribute to flooding. We have some 19 here, a lot more, but these stem from land development pressures within floodplains, to number 4, sand berms, to 5, poor drainage maintenance on private lands, 7, unenforceable building codes. We have number 9, construction materials dumped within the roadway. Is a habit in Barbados where persons during constructing a house, their lots are no longer larger than 400 or 500 square meters. So the sand and aggregate is dumped on the verge of the road verge, but it spills into the road. When the floods, waters come along, they're being conveyed, they take this debris to wells or the drainage facility that disposes of the rainfall. You have weak drainage enforcement. You have, in 14, absence of sound soil conservation practices. 17, water course environment not understood. Our populations prior to development, modern development, use the water courses, and my research indicate in terms of it's been very old persons in excess of 75 years in the 2005, revealed that the water course had a higher value. And unlike today, so what they did, persons walked the water course and there were links between communities. They used it not only for walking and short travel time, but also to pick up medicinal plants. And funny enough, before the advance of gas stoves and kerosene stoves, they pick up brambles and wood for firewood. What this did, this attempted then to remove the brambles that now, after development of, and people move away from firewood and use modern methods of cooking, appliances for cooking. These are now the debris that is floating downstream and blocking culverts. So we ask the question, is development positive? Or it begs the question, sorry. And of course then, in 19, limited flood response capacity. Next slide. So we move to then flood challenges on biosecurity, but this time we look at 4 other, I disaggregate then a number of those activities on the land and break them up into 5 categories. We look at those then that, and remember that biosecurity looks at the protection of human and animals from threats. We then look at what do people do? And in this group, the first group we talk about breed vermin, whether it be mosquitoes, rats, flies, the like. And then we have indiscriminate disposal of garbage, debris, and bulk waste. We have utility infrastructure cited over drainage systems. In Barbados, we have utility companies, and I think other parts in the world have seen it. Yes, in the roadway, but sometimes they use the underground culverts and drains as to move the infrastructure across instead of excavating the side of the culvert. And oftentimes you have a water authority, a potable water pipeline going perpendicular across the culvert, and not in the top third, but the bottom third where the energy level is in the drain. And these are areas where you have garbage and debris blocking the drains and creating flooding. Even though the utility, the infrastructure can have a higher flow efficiency. We have a high proportion of plastics in debris taken from drains, and I should say here from wells. In some areas where in Barbados, there are 2 sites, along both in the south coast and the west coast, where the volume of plastics, and these are PET bottles and the food containers, in excess of 70% of the waste in the well. And we discovered sub wells we use for disposing of, one of the measures we use to dispose stormwater in scarce limestone. And then we have, of course, household waste, disposing of the household waste in the road onto the roadway. In the urban areas of South Bridgetown, you have lands that are deep, the old peat soil type soil, no bedrock, deep soils in excess of 5-6 meters. And in these areas, of course, with low-cost housing, there's no sewage plant, but persons use pit latrines that are transformed to waterborne systems. They may, but with the water sewer system, they connect their sewage to the pipeline, but the sewage, which is the waste, that kitchen waste and the bathroom shower waste, is disposed onto the road. In marine, we have activities of high sediment load on the east coast of Falls. We have in the east coast, the east coast of Barbados is part of the Scotland district, but not all clays. And you have violent high watercourse slopes and moderate to high rainfall, which result in high velocities and violent storm flows. And these take a significant amount of erosion and create plumes into the marine environment. And then we have land-based pollution being discharged from our falls with pesticides, fertilizers, and animals, dead animals at times. And then, of course, gully flows have a high rate of discharge due to high intensity rainfalls and sea flows into the marine environment, and these have concerns for protection of the coastline in terms of beach accretion, sand accretion, and of course in terms of fisheries production. And then food insecurity, farmlands. We have farmlands being on our complaints list. Persons do complain of their lands, particularly cash crops, being lost due to floods and flooding. And then of course, water quality. Go back. And water quality, we have disposal of chemical waste in containers into wells or into retention ponds and other structures. Because of course, we have aquifer, or potable water is stored in aquifer, and these are potential contaminants for the aquifers and of course the type of water quality we have. And we are, of course then rely in our system of stormwater management, flood mitigation. We relied a lot before on well system to solve problems. We moved away from that and introduced other systems, but it's still the predominant method of flood disposal. And then of course, again, farmers don't always follow the methods for instructions for chemical applications on crops. And then we have a number of crops with high incidence or potentially high incidence of these chemicals, and of course moving up the food chain in animals and in humans. Next. So we then look at the flood impacts on biosecurity. Now we look then at, out of those threats, the concerns, we then look then towards flood contributors and see what is the biosecurity issues of concern and the impacts on biosecurity for these flood impacts. Flood contributors, we have standing waters, we have poor sanitation and low nutrition. When we have life-threatening, flood waters could be high, so we have potential, and we have persons who have drowned, we have loss of limbs, persons fall into drains, the diabetic, we've had persons who have in flood waters hurt their limbs and had to be amputated over time. We had reduced morbidity, mortality from disease, respiratory infections. In the context of vermin, we have, when our flood response teams are going out, particularly in the urban, just outside the urban, in the urban area of Bridgetown, you have again rats breed and live in underground systems, and no difference from the stormwater drains and culverts. So you see rats swimming in water. So you have rodents, you have bacteria, you have ticks from the animals, and you have cockroaches and the like, and mosquitoes, and the associated threat to life from those. And food insecurity, again, you have poor nutrition, inadequate hygiene, and poor sanitation. You have floods affecting food crops. You have persons not able to access their food, and particularly where persons do the homesteads, they do not have the amount of vegetables they have and food to support body needs. In the marine environment, those plumes we talked about earlier and the chemicals to the marine environment smother corals and kill fish fries. In the waterborne systems, in waterborne, we have then a number of diseases and the like threats that comes from flood impacts, whether from lepto, typhoid, hepatitis, womb infections, skin rashes, tetanus, gastroenteritis, diarrhea. I should say that in terms of our people, we often send our flood responses every year for vaccinations and for shots from a number of these waterborne illnesses, potential illnesses. So speaking about it is one thing, but our approach then to flood mitigation, how we deal with biosecurity, even though we don't speak to it in context of biosecurity, we talk about environmental management, is one of the things that we look at. So we have two approaches to flood mitigation measures. We should say though that the approach to flood management in Barbados is really an integrated flood management approach. This is a UN subset of integrated water resources management. And so we enshrine that model to as the model for flood mitigation. So we have a structural approach. We try to reduce the incidence of flooding or prevent it. And then we have mitigation measures. So we have the flood disaster strategies and the structural retarding methods, watercourse methods or watercourse environment. And we have a number of mitigation structures we can look at depending on the assessment of the flooding and the affordability, or if you want to do a social engineering approach or hard structural engineering approach. Next. Then we go to non-structural approaches. We recognize and integrated flood management recognizes, and in context of disaster management. Next slide, please. Next, we may have to live with floods. The amount of monies required to solve these flood problems are not available in a 2-3 year strategic plan. And so living with floods, we have to move to non-structural, what we consider sometimes living with floods. And sometimes living with floods recognize that people want to have a right type of education approach to it and community development, particularly parting into it. Then persons can adapt and cope with it. So you have data collection. We need to fuel flood sciences by having data collection. We have to recognize educational and awareness methodologies. And of course, floodplain management. Within the floodplain, you have waters. You have to ensure you have land use planning is the best approach, but you also can conduct floodplain mapping. And in our case, we don't always do a scientific approach, but we do flood observations and relate the depth of runoff, the depth of rainfall to the area inundated. And that's an accrued approach to hazard mapping. And that is also used later on when the science is in use to calibrate the models. And of course, flood insurances. And then we need to respond to flood events through emergency activities, whether it be flood lighting, flood rescue, and the different agencies. And I heard Sagong speak about the disaster management cycle. We look in here at mitigation, yes, to do the work, preparation, response, and then recovery. And then we have legislation that speak to enforcement. Next slide. Yeah. And then we have the institutional approach. These are grounded within a number of laws, a number of models. So the first one has to do with groundwater protection. Barbados is fortunate to have, in the early 60s, studies that dealt with the concerns of aquifer and vulnerability to aquifer, and they had a ground protection zone policy and law, and that served us well a lot by having a zonal, and zone 1 being the region around that covered an aquifer, and based on travel days, we were able to protect those aquifers. We built on it in more scientific work over the time. And we are also, in terms of flood management, use that the guidelines or look, I would say travel days, yes. So that we ensure that our sub wells or method for sewage for stormwater disposal does not decrease the overburden on the aquifer. So we go to a shallow depth in those areas and accept levels of flooding within the zone 1s. I mentioned just the utility of the integrated flood management model to stormwater. We follow other environmental related laws in the island, whether they be planning acts, the number of health acts, the solid waste, marine pollution, disaster management act. We follow those in our work. And of course, then we look towards utility of technologies, geographic information systems, the map of where work. I saw Dr. Dawson on. We've had quite a bit of work done in foundation and using students, and we also supervise master students or fellowships in stormwater and use the technologies for those persons to bring us to another level. We use WhatsApp in our reporting. In fact, this is one of the benefits out of COVID, where we're doing work, we got persons to use the WhatsApp to report before and after applications of maintenance, and it works well. It continued, and it's one of the flagships in the department in terms of time responses and measuring times and activities when things were done. and flood level monitoring and asset management. Yes, capacity building. We still don't have all the skills required in the division to conduct the work, but we build capacity through linkages with research. We identify research issues, research topics, and get students, and we also outsource some of the work to private practice. And of course, we follow strict safety and health practices with regard to our staff. Thank you.
Mr. Yerba, thank you so much for taking the time to present, especially the flooding situation and what is being done in Barbados. I'm quite sure those from the UK will find it very interesting. We may have some similarities or some uniqueness here in Barbados, and we're thankful for your presentation. I know you have to leave early, but would you be able to answer any questions?
Yes.
Dr. Douglas?
I will stay on for another 20 minutes.
Okay, so let's take advantage of the presence of Mr. Yearwood. I think there are a number of questions that I see in the Q&A chat, and I have a few of my own, but I will let the audience go first. There is the first question from Ms. Terry Pounder. By the way, that was an excellent presentation, Mr. Yearwood. I quite enjoyed it. It was very informative as I learned a lot more about Barbados and the drainage issues that we have and the plans also that we have in place. The question goes within drainage unit and the broader ministry, have there been avenues for staff to update their knowledge and awareness on how climate change is impacting the drainage and infrastructure in Barbados? And is there interest in doing so?
Yes, there is. But I should say that I'm not happy with the level of depth which has gone. At the professional level and the tactical level, yes, there has been a number of, there've been one study, well, two studies, but one study that dealt particularly with climate change. And the last drainage study, 2018, dealt predominantly with climate change and flooding, though it focused only on the West Coast. But there are other departments of the Ministry of the Environment, other ministry, coastal zone and like, who are in the forerunner, the Center for Climate Change, the Service Department, and you had Dr. Nurse in the early days, who were on the panel, in the same panel, who did a lot of work on trying to translate climate change on the ground in Barbados. We know that Barbados is small and fine grained. So a lot of the things we're looking at, in fact, when we tell heat, the number of agencies, EPD and other agencies. So we're talking about drainage, we are part of a larger organization who's doing work and in government, in private sector, in research, in academia, who we are involved in and who invite us to these type of discussions, who, when we are dealing with consultancies, it is now the state, the fair company that any consultancy must consider climate change, have climate change considerations, to the point where the last drainage study in 2018 I spoke of did not look at flooding and flooding as a minor. It was really with heavy considerations and countermeasures for climate change. And so, but at the operative level, we have not drilled down to that level. But in short, in terms of our methods and techniques, we have used them to incorporate them into our method statements.
Okay, so I guess the question in terms of training is yes, you would, and there has been, yes, and also that there is still a desire for deeper, more in-depth training
Indeed.
for staff. Okay. All right. So the other question I saw here was in relation to weak, and this is from Ms. Regina Thomas. You mentioned weak drainage enforcement. What would you recommend to reduce the risk of flooding and help with drainage in Barbados?
Enforcement, we have different populations. We start with concerned that there are persons who are not aware that they are not practicing sound stormwater, following some using strong stormwater principles, sound principles here. So it's one of education and knowledge, and the approach, particularly, and those of lower affordability. When you talk about laws, you always talk about, you must speak to affordability. So then there is a need to look at, yes, there's an infraction or a person's activities on the land may be negative and impact flooding. You start to say, look, you want to explain to them the actions, how they can make good. And then you look towards then other, and even if it doesn't only happen to those who have low affordability, some persons also carry out works without engaging professionals. And that is where then you have to go towards a harder stick approach to following the physical development planning regulations. So there are different approaches to it, but it has to be also, I find that we are weak in the department that way because we have not done psychometric evaluation of persons who are enforcers. It is easy to say, you can't just send anyone out to be an enforcer. The person has to be that type of person. First, knowledge is important, yes, but having the knowledge, there's some persons who are soft on it. And so we've started a discussion on making persons aware of their position within the psychometric table and say, look, you need to strengthen this area of a person to deal as a enforcer. And of course, there are persons, their powers above you break down, but it doesn't mean that. It means that you do your work and you're able to write and approach anyone and speak to the issue. And that is some of the things we found within our staffing itself.
Okay, very interesting. I think too, you raise a very key point in terms of behavioral analysis and psychometric analysis of, for instance, your staff, but I think also in terms of having that level of analysis within the population to kind of gear and guide your risk communication, because I know you have mentioned that that was a key challenge within drainage and within the issue of flooding. And so that's where I see, for instance, the Faculty of Social Sciences really trying to help in terms of conducting that type of research that will hopefully get us over that hump that we keep, our wall that we keep running into. I think that the issue of flooding is a serious issue, one that is perennial. We only really discuss it when it is literally knocking at our door, whether this be our car doors or our homes, the doors of our homes. So I think there needs to be, as you said, a systematic push in terms of education, in terms of getting everyone on board with it. I know there are many other questions that you have for Mr. Yearwood. I do too, but unfortunately, we can't ask all of them at the same time. So what I will do, I will take these questions, we will send them to him, and we will try to get these questions answered and then send out the answers via email, because your email address hopefully would have been registered, and we will send this out for this particular webinar. But as time moves on, I wish we could spend all evening here, but I know we all have other things we would like to do. So we want to move on to the next webinar presentation. And that presentation will be given by Mr. Brian Nelson, and he is the Director of Resilience at RAB Consultants in the UK. His topic will be risk management, floods, and engineering. Mr. Brian Nelson has 30 years of experience in all areas of emergency management. He's a specialist, he has specialist experience rather, in flood incident mitigation, flood incident management, including the preparation for, the response to, and the recovery from flood events. He has managed a wealth of local, national, and international projects involving flood awareness, forecasting, warning, response, and recovery. Mr. Nelson is an experienced and respected project manager who has used his skills on a variety of incident management and business continuity projects at both single and multi-agency organizational levels. Mr. Nelson is an accomplished exercise director, trainer, and facilitator who has developed and delivered numerous training courses, exercises, and workshops. Also, who will be co-presenting with him is Ms. Sophie Dustin, and she's the Senior Resilience Advisor from RAB Consultants as well. And Ms. Dustin has over 10 years of experience in the resilience sector, helping UK and international clients to improve their organizational readiness to respond to incidents. Ms. Dustin is also a certified trainer and leads the delivery of incident management training courses on behalf of RAB. Ms. Dustin's academic and professional career has spanned all aspects of the emergency planning cycle, conducting risk assessments, developing concept of operations, preparing incident plans, training duty officers across strategic, tactical, and operational tiers, and validating plans and rehearsing incident response through exercising. Ms. Dustin is also a member of the Institute of Civil Protection and Emergency Management and is certified with the Business Continuity Institute. Thank you very much. You may go ahead, Brian.
Thank you very much, Kirk, Dr. Douglas, co-panelists, and people joining the webinar. Hopefully you can hear me clearly from the UK and you can see my screen. So really interesting to hear the first two presenters, and I think what Sophie and I are going to present to you in the next 10 or 15 minutes really enhances and builds on what we've already heard. So we're going to take you on a journey from taking you through sort of assessing the risks and those areas at risks of flooding, the preparedness that can take place, raising community awareness, the ability to forecast and warn people, good practice in responding to incidents and recovery as well. And then I've got a few slides on flood defences, the different types of flood defences. It's really interesting to see here that last presentation there that, you know, there's a lot of things I think that, you know, you can probably help yourselves in the Caribbean to do that you've already got. It's just a case of a little bit of coordination, a little bit of education, a little bit of will, and I think, you know, you can make a big difference, you know, without investing great sums of money, just by maintaining what you've got probably a little bit better. But without any further ado, let's go through my presentation. So I'm going to just touch on climate change in the Caribbean, and Sophie and I are going to talk to you about good practice emergency management in the UK, and finish on response and defences. Sophie, would you like to just say hello?
Yep. Hello, everyone. You hear me okay, Brian?
Yes.
Super. Really pleased to be here today. And I'll be contributing to this presentation with Brian, looking at UK flood emergency response. Thanks, Brian.
Thanks very much, and I have to thank you, Kirk, for inviting us to your webinar. It's nice to be here. You know, we've our paths have crossed, and we are collaborating on initiatives in the Caribbean, particularly in Trinidad and Tobago, and I know one or two of the audience members are part of our collaboration as well. So it's great to be part of the team. Right, so let's start with climate change then. And basically, climate change is the long-term shift in temperature and weather patterns. And basically, the hotter the world gets, the more energy the atmosphere has got, the more moisture it absorbs and turns it into rain clouds and storms, and the more intense and frequent those storms are, and we suffer the consequences of the impacts. So unless we curb and reduce what we do, it's only going to get worse. And current projections are 3.2 centigrade rise by 2100, and we really need to keep that to about 1.5 degrees Celsius if we want to start improving and starting to reverse this upward trend of climate change. So on the top part of this slide, we've got the climate impacts, and appropriate to this webinar, it really is that one more intense and frequent flooding. So, and in the Caribbean, I know it's the hurricane season, and you've just had Hurricane Fiona go through parts of it, and it's actually caused unprecedented damage in Canada, Nova Scotia, Newfoundland, because of the abnormal high sea temperatures further north in the Atlantic, which has just kept the weather system fueled. And that's why the impacts have been so great. So we need to do something about it, and the world does, and let's hope we do. So the environmental impacts are at the bottom there, and I suppose the ones that jump out at me are those injuries and fatalities, and the trauma, and the the well-being impacts it has. I mean, the health impacts and the impacts on the health industries, they're all clear as well, but it's the intensity of storms. And in the Caribbean, my word, you do get your fair few storms. So in the UK, just in 2021 alone, I mean, these two slides really cover riverine flooding that Mr. Yeard was talking about, or sometimes called fluvial flooding. But we have to remember that there are many sources of flooding, from river flooding, from surface water flooding, sometimes called pluvial flooding, groundwater flooding, coastal flooding, tidal flooding, and often, it's a mixture of all of those things that causes the impact. And when you get intense storms, it's often flash floods, like some of the examples on the screen in the UK, that cause all the damage. It comes very quickly, and it's sometimes, the time to be able to react and protect lives and livelihoods is very short. And to be honest, that's what this business is all about. It's protecting livelihoods and minimizing the damage, and looking at opportunities that we can put in place within our capability to mitigate some of those risks. So when we look at the question about risks and mitigating it, it is about recognizing those risks and reducing those risks. So it's good for me to compare and contrast, and I look at some of the pictures on this slide, and then I flick to some of the recent experiences that you've had in recent years: Trinidad and Tobago, Haiti. There's the top left, Hurricane Fiona that's just gone through, and you can see a mixture of river flooding and probably surface water flooding. And it's really difficult. We are looking at extreme events, and it's really difficult to look at how we could build defences and put infrastructure in place to manage this. I think the best we can do is look at options for mitigating it, and we've got to accept, we've got to live with it to a degree. So what else in addition can we do in order to live with it? And Sophie and I, in the next few slides, will describe some good practice in the UK that we adopt that does work really, really well. So it's just worth looking at the incident stages. Now it's interesting how these terms, I use the word incident here. So, when does an incident become a disaster, and when does a disaster become an emergency, and when does the emergency become a crisis? And I think in the world of emergency management, we've got to be careful with these terms, but they're all incidents to different levels of severity. So this graph simply shows the activities on the y-axis over a timeline on the x-axis, and the yellow represents the yellow explosion. Floods don't happen in an explosion like a fire does, or what have you. They build up. Obviously, when you get hurricanes and thunderstorms, they come at you very quickly. When you get weather systems that you can forecast coming towards you, like we're fortunate in the UK, we can forecast the track of weather systems across the Atlantic, and we've got a lot more time. So it gives us more time to establish our response capability in that rising limb there. And then, once we know there's something coming, we're prepared. That horizontal bar at the top is us managing that the rain's coming, there's flooding happening, the rivers are rising. We got to manage that response to the point where, and we got to manage it in an integrated way with, it's not just one organization, it's all organizations affected, all the way down to utilities, communications, all sorts of, emergency responders and what have you. Until you get to a point where the incident's resolved and you start then to stand down your response capability, and then you've got to deal with all of the mess, and you've got to clean the mess up, and you've got to get back to a state of normality. But often that recovery takes not weeks, not months, but years. And if you look at the impacts of some of your earthquakes and your hurricanes, particularly in Haiti comes to mind, it just takes an awful long time. And and depending on your infrastructure, it can certainly hinder your operations somewhat. So that's just a bit an introduction on climate change and some of the impacts. And I'm going to hand over to Sophie at this point, and we're going to talk you through what do we do in the UK. I'll drive for you, Sophie.
Thanks, Brian. So before we get into the detail of it, just wanted to frame the context of what governs our behaviour in flood emergency management in the UK. So in the middle boxes are the legislation and the framework and guidance that relates to purely emergency planning, so not just flooding. So we've got legislation in place which places a duty on a number of different organisations to respond to incidents. And their behaviour is governed by a concept of operations that's driven by central government, and there's supporting guidance that underpins that. And if we go to the right-hand side boxes, these are more related to flood and water management. So there's a whole suite of legislation, but two key pieces of legislation relating to flood management is the Flood and Water Management Act and the Reservoirs Act. And that really governs how we manage water in the UK. And in terms of responding to flood emergencies, there is a national framework in place for England, which goes through all the roles and responsibilities of different partner organisations. And all of those are supported by a number of other plans which sit beneath the main overarching flood emergency framework. Next slide, please, Brian.
Yep, should be there for you.
So UK responders work to principles of joint working have come about from a number of years of feedback and consultations, and they refer to really how organisations will come together to respond in a more effective manner. So co-location, the number one, it's evidence has shown that particularly at what we call a tactical level or strategic level, getting around a table or even meeting at the near to the incident scene to be able to have those discussions face to face and be able to say, right, what we're going to do, what's our plan of action, what are our decisions. Just facilitating those discussions is much easier in a face-to-face environment than it is being more remote, because when you're remote, you have more barriers to communications. And you can see the second principle there is to communicate. Effective communication really drives a response. When you think around flood warnings going out and being issued and acting upon those, you can have the best kind of technology in the world, but you need to be able to get the message out and people to act on that, and that all comes through the communication and communicating the messages. So effective communication and cooperating with one another, co-locating and coordination, and Brian's mentioned this around that coordination piece is, when you've got a number of different players involved in the response, who's actually taking the lead or who's responsible for taking the lead, and who is going to ultimately make some of the big joint decisions that are needed on the response. So one of the principles is around coordination and making sure you've got the structures in place to be able to coordinate your response. The next two are kind of come hand in hand. We talk over here about shared situational awareness, and that's making sure that everybody that is responding from an emergency point of view has the same understanding of the risk and the same understanding of what's going on. So what has happened, what is happening, what could happen. And that enables you to plan more effectively your response and to make those decisions when you're all on the same page. If people are referring to different versions of the truth, that's when, you know, weaknesses and challenges come into the response in particular. So that shared situational awareness is really key. So these are the principles that responding organizations work towards when responding to incidents. Now, one thing that helps to kind of enable the communication piece is a platform that's been developed by our central government called Resilience Direct. So this is a platform that is accessible to multiple organizations. They have to be a responding organization. And it has a geographic information system interface, so interactive maps that you can zoom in and out of, and it hosts a number of different organizations' data sets. So in England, the Environment Agency produced flood maps. So on Resilience Direct, you'll be able to load modelled flood extents above the GIS background mapping to see what potential impacts there could be. It's also where multi-agency emergency plans are stored, so you can quickly access those and find what procedures you may need to follow or implement. And you can share information in real time. You can edit the map and upload information. So if you know where perhaps areas may be cordoned off by some authorities because it's not safe for people to enter those, they would be able to actually map that on the GIS interface so that all the other organizations were clear on exactly where the cordon was. So it's a really powerful tool, and because one of the key findings was that sharing information is always a battle anyway. There can be a number of challenges to that, and one of those is ownership of the data, control of the data, and also security. So this is why central government invested in developing a platform, because they would invest in the security aspect to make sure it was robust enough for organizations to be able to share such sensitive information. And there's memorandums of understanding around the use and sharing of any data sets that are hosted on Resilience Direct. Okay, Brian. So quite a few years ago, we had a big turning point in our industry, and that was severe flooding that happened way back in 2007 now. It might be something that you may have been aware of. It may have made the international news because it was so substantial in the UK. So in the summer of 2007, essentially we had an absolute deluge over the summer. And it got to the point where, and people use this word quite often, unprecedented, but at the time it really felt like an unprecedented event. River levels got to their highest levels on a number of gauging stations throughout the country. It smashed records. And the image you can see there is a village along one of our rivers, which was completely cut off and isolated. And that's the first time it's ever kind of happened in living memory that it's got that bad. The statistics you can see there kind of just reinforces it really. The amount of properties that were flooded, and perhaps more the disruption to communities through the loss of essential services. There were a city that was reliant on bottled water because their substation had to be temporarily shut because it was at risk of being inundated while they put in temporary measures around it. So it was a huge event, and because of that, following the event, the government procured an independent review into what happened, and that was called the Pitt Review. And out of it came 92 recommendations. And these recommendations have since been, the vast majority have since been implemented. And it led to the formation of a partnership between two of the main bodies, particularly in England. So we have the Met Office, who are concerned with anything that's in the sky in terms of rain, and then the moment it hits the ground, that's kind of when we think that's when the Environment Agency take over. So if the rain's in the sky, the Met Office cares about it. If it hits the ground, the Environment Agency cares about it. But they need to speak to one another, because, you know, the Environment Agency need to know what's going to happen in the sky and how much rain's going to fall, because then that helps them to consider what the impacts will be on the rivers. So they form this partnership, the Flood Forecasting Centre. It's operational 24/7. It provides a wide range of services, and one of the key services it provides is a flood outlook called a flood guidance statement. And that's a 5-day flood outlook. And it considers all major sources of flooding, so riverine, surface water, groundwater, coastal and tidal. And it's a judgment on what's the likelihood of flooding and what are the impacts going to be. And it color codes it on a traffic light system, red, amber, yellow and green, to give an indication on the risk outlook. And it's produced daily, sometimes twice a day during events. But it's to answer that question of what is likely to happen and by when, because in the large flood event, and I think it was a fire commander who said in the consultation, all we want to know is what's likely to happen and by when, because we need to move our assets. We've got big pumps, we've got big pieces of equipment that we can mobilize, but there's no point us mobilizing it if we don't know where to put it. We need to put it in areas that are, you know, at heightened risk. So this is primarily the reason why this came about, this flood guidance statement, was to help those that are in positions of managing resources and large resources consider where to put assets. Okay, Brian. So the main uses are, it drives that common understanding of risk, so one of those joint principles, to enable more effective decision making. It triggers those preparedness activities that I was mentioning, asset checks, scaling up resources and rostering, you know, getting those people which are on standby, you know, starting to get them mobilized. And it just provides that greater lead time to be able to escalate your response structure. So if you've got, you know, amber or red on the flood guidance statement, you know something's coming. So you can start to put the wheels in motion to get prepared for what may come down the line. Another change that was brought about by the PIT review was our flood warning codes. So our Environment Agency provides a flood warning service for large rivers in England. And originally, this was based on kind of what we now consider to be more of an outdated warning symbols, which weren't well understood within the general public. So they updated those to something that provided a more clearer communication message on what people were expected to do upon receipt of those alerts and warnings. So we've got different severities. So we've got flood alert, which is prepare. So there's possible flooding. It's normally around 2 days to about 6 hours before any likely onset of floodings to occur. So it's just heightens that awareness that there's something that may occur down the line. You've then got a flood warning. So this is when the probability of flooding is increased. Therefore, there is a need to act upon that. So perhaps put in place any flood plans or any temporary measures that you might have around your property. So any flood boards or something like that, put them in place. And then a severe flood warning is issued when there is a danger to life. And that's why there is that survive there. So that's really only ever issued in those very extreme cases where there's real fast flowing water. There might be really significant community destruction or a risk to life. And coupled with that, there's now very much a drive to provide more impact-led flood warning messages. So not just saying when and where it may potentially flood, but also what sort of impacts it's going to be. So accounting for more local characteristics in the description. So, you know, if within each flood warning, it's bespoke to a particular area which has been predefined based on flood modeling or historic flood extents. So it might be the case of adding the, you know, if it's a notorious road that would be expected to flood, it might be adding that into the description to say the A441 through Redditch is likely to experience significant flood depths and will likely close. So it encourages the public to act, but there's also a need for accounting for that population, that transient population that might be moving through an area and won't necessarily have been registered to pick up the warnings, or there might be a case that actually you need to get the word out to everyone and not just those who may have opted in to sign up to a flood warning service. So this is where, and it's very much new and hot off the press, there'll be an emergency alert system similar to what they've got in place in New Zealand, for those of you that are aware of it, where it uses cell broadcasting on a mobile to send out a warning or an alert across a population. So it provides a greater reach. So it's something that's being trialed at the moment and is looking to be rolled out within the next couple of years. Another thing that came about from the PIT review is a drive to be major incident ready. So, you know, we know that we're going to get these more extreme events, and the likelihood of those are going to be more frequent, which means we need to be better prepared for those and adapt where possible. So the main organisation that provides warnings and does a lot of the flood response from an asset point of view as well is the Environment Agency. So they've developed this concept of operations where they have cells within their response structure that they can scale up. So cells are what some countries call sections. It could be modules or units, but essentially it's a functional work area. So if you've got a small scale incident, it might be the case you have one person working on the planning, one person in logistics. But if you get to a very extreme event, you might need all hands on the deck. So actually you might have 12 people working in the planning cell. So it's just a structure to enable you to escalate and de-escalate according to the pace and scale of the incident. So they've brought in that structure. And to support that, they have major incident plans that guide all actions, decisions and resources. So they look at the worst case scenario, and there's lots of timelines, maps and photos, very visual aids to support those cells in determining the next steps. And that forms part of organisational resilience. So, you know, when we're looking at climate change, it's not just preparedness from an asset point of view, but also from an organisational point of view, and it kind of links into business continuity. So it's making sure as organisations that each organisation, if you are involved from a response point of view in particular, that you've got those defined structures and roles and responsibilities. You've got those plans in place that tells you what you need to do and when. Your staff are trained on what to do. And then the plans are tested. You don't want to test them in a real incident. You want to make sure it's in a safe training environment. And then throughout all of that, you always need to debrief after incidents and incorporate those lessons and embed those. It's a continuous cycle. So all of that improving organisational resilience will put organisations in a better place to be able to respond. Okay, Brian.
Thank you, Sophie. Back to me for the last few slides. Folks, I'm going to talk a little bit about flood defences. So, right, okay, so building and maintaining flood defences. We've had touched on this a little bit in the first two, particularly the second presentation, but the left-hand picture here, just a picture of building defences. And when we're investing in defences, you know, the benefits or the you know, the cost of the damages should you not build it has got to outweigh the costs of building the defences. So in order to build defences, we need to know the areas of risk, and we need to know the source of flooding, and we need to do a lot of hydrology and modelling so that the defences are built in the right place to the right height to deal with the risk and that source of flooding. The middle picture is an example of a flood wall, and the message here is that once you've built defences, you don't just leave them alone. You've got to inspect the condition of them. And when that defence starts to crack or starts to deteriorate, you need to do maintenance on it. So the message on that one really is to inspect it, assess its condition. And if that defence is saying, hey, look, I'm starting to wear out here a little bit. I need a little bit of patching up. It's important that money's invested and the condition of the defence is maintained. And the picture on the right hand side is an example of where it's not cost viable to build large flood defences at at quite a large expense. There's a cheaper option where it's viable to protect individual properties, so protecting windows and doors and air bricks and the use of submersible pumps. There are alternatives there. Now, just brought this slide back in because when we look at some of the defence options in this slide, we've got to then, the reality of it in the Caribbean and some of the extreme, natural hazards that you face. It's important to get the context right. So it's important to get the mapping right, the right solutions right, where we can protect property, and where we can't protect property. The slides that Sophie's gone through in the forecasting and the warning and the procedures and the preparing is really, really important. So where we can't protect property, we've got to protect people and save lives. And if you don't inspect them, what happens is they fail. So you can see an example of a breach in a flood in an earth embankment on the right-hand side. And in the middle slide, that actually is the side of the flood bank that actually the water's been flowing through underneath. And if you people experienced in inspecting defences will pick this up and understand what's happened. But the message is to emphasise the importance of maintaining the defences and use them for what they're intended to do. I recall Mr. Yearwood mentioning some of the various uses on some of the defences. You might have picked up on the international news in 2019. There was a reservoir near Manchester where the dam wall the water started to overtop, and a weakness developed in the dam wall, and there was a risk to the community downstream. And the orange area illustrates the area at risk. And this illustrates the area where the community was issued with a severe flood warning. And Sophie mentioned severe flood warnings a few slides ago, only used in extreme cases. So 1,500 people were evacuated from the downstream affected areas. And that warning was in force for 8 days. And what they did to stop it from, if it completely failed and breached, the impacts would have been catastrophic. So they brought in, RAF helicopter to drop sand ballast to put some weight on the defences, and it did work. And by doing this and then pumping and diverting water out of the reservoir, they were able to lower the water levels, and unfortunately, the catastrophe didn't happen. And then they quickly put some emergency plans in place to make sure that everything was tested. And at RAB, we were fortunate enough to be able to design and run that exercise for them. So the message here is just about defences, building the right defences, maintaining them, and when they do start to fail, it's just having plans in place to deal with repairs pretty quickly. And sometimes where you can't protect properties and you can't spend money on big earth banks and flood walls, In the UK, there's an increasing use of what we call temporary defences, whereby we erect, whereby we bring in temporary defences, and by early forecasting, we've got enough time to be able to erect the temporary defences and protect properties behind that you can see in the picture. And they do work quite effectively. And to support that, the authorities have got what they call temporary defence deployment plans. So they are temporary defences, they are deployed. It's a plan that tells authorities and people who are trained as responders. It tells them what to do, what the triggers are, the logistics, the mobilisation, the transportation, where to take the equipment, how many people are needed to build it, how many people are needed to maintain it, what's the public access, how do we alert the public living around these temporary defences, because it can look quite scary, and the impact on people's well-being can be significant. So these do work particularly well, increasing use of these in the UK. So, conscious of time, some takeaways on here that we've taken you to journey. The first one is to know the areas at risk from flooding, get them mapped out so you know where your risk areas are, and don't forget the multiple sources of flooding. We've not majored on community awareness too much, but actually, Mr. Yearwood, you did talk about raising community awareness a fair bit, and really, it's as well as protecting defences and not dumping rubbish all over and blocking culverts, etc. It's raising community awareness of the risks around them from the particular source of flooding. The third one is to look at options and build and maintain those defences in those at-risk areas. The fourth one is establishing a forecasting and warning capability, which Sophie talked a lot about. And you need plans and procedures in place to follow. And when it does happen, you're all prepared to respond. You do your best as responders in an integrated way, and you learn your lessons afterwards. Don't forget to learn your lessons. And then hopefully when it happens again, you will be better prepared. And that's the end of our presentation, Dr. Douglas. I hope you found that informative. I can see there's the numbers are increasing in the chat and the Q&A, so it probably generated a bit of interest there by the look of it.
Yes, thank you very much, Brian, and thank you very much, Sophie, for another insightful and informative presentation on how the UK is actually adapting their flood mitigation plans and their disaster risk management plans to deal with the barrage of impacts that climate change is bringing their way. We just have time for, I would say, one question, and then we're going to go right into the next one. There's one from Jeremy Collymore. He asks, what is the UK's experience in anticipating and managing non-human biosecurity issues in major flood events?
Sophie, do you want to come in on that one?
If not, we can defer it to later. You guys can respond to it, because we'll send out a list of the questions to the relevant presenters if you guys don't have an answer right now.
Yeah, that'd be. I prefer to do that, Kirk, if you don't mind, and we'll respond to all of them and give a bit of time and thought to it.
Sure, no problem at all.
Cheers.
All right, so the next presenter will be Professor Troy Lord, and he will be presenting on climate change, tourism, and sustainable development. And you would have heard Professor Lord before. He's the Dean of the Faculty of Social Sciences and a Professor of Tourism Economics at the University of the West Indies Cave Hill campus. And he earned his Bachelor's of Science in Economics and Accounting at the UWI with first-class honors. He did his Master's in Economics at York University in Canada, and then a PhD in Tourism Economics at the University of Surrey in the UK. Professor Lord has published 46 papers in peer-reviewed journals, 9 book chapters and monographs, and presented at 47 conferences. He has also prepared 7 technical reports, Professor Lord has received a number of research grants and awards from the UWI, including the prestigious Principals Award for Excellence in Research, the Campus Award for the Best Collaborative Research, and Campus Award for in recognition of researchers, research teams who have won significant funding. He is also currently serves as the Deputy Chairman of the Agricultural Development Fund in the Ministry of Agriculture and Food Security, and as a member of the Minimum Wage Board in the Ministry of Labor and Social Security Relations. He is a member of the Conference of the Latin America Network for Research on Services, or REDLAS, Academic Committee, a member of the International Association of Tourism Economics, and formerly a member of the Commonwealth Specialist Pool of Consultants on Small States and Climate Finance. Professor Lord, I'll turn over to you.
Thank you, Kirk, and good afternoon to our panel and those following once again. So when I got the invitation to sit on this panel, of course, naturally, themes certainly suggests points to persons in a very technical background in relation to flooding and so forth. So engineers, geographers, and the like. Nonetheless, I tried to unpack the theme. Climate change is one, sustainable development is another. And of course, as most of the presenters thus far have really focused on, the attention has been on flooding. So naturally, my perspective comes from, it says there, tourism economics, but really a social science perspective. And so I come to this from a different angle, even as I attempt to marry what I'm going to say with the whole focus on flooding. But the focus, broadly speaking, though, is on tourism. And we will see how I marry this phenomenon, tourism, with climate change, sustainable development, and perhaps how we can ultimately try to link it to flooding. But it will definitely be very different from what you've seen thus far. So, I mean, first, I will say, and the slide will tell you, I mean, tourism, though, it presents significant sustainable development policy dilemmas, okay? On one hand, it is a major source of foreign exchange for many countries. It is considered relatively benign in terms of economic development and employment generation, but it is increasingly recognized, and for a long time, that tourism is a significant contributor to undesirable socioeconomic environmental changes, including biodiversity loss and climate change loss. So tourism's role in sustainable development, and I mean, that's the broad theme, and I don't really think I heard anyone really delve into sustainable development as a concept and a definition. But I mean, I'll try to do that. But certainly, tourism's role in sustainable development highlights what I would call the inherent contradictions and complexities of translating notions of sustainability into our political realities, particularly our post-carbon political realities. And also, as I mentioned, because of focus on the theme, centrality of climate change to the sustainable development issue. So tourism contributes to climate change, and it is also strongly affected by climate change. So there's a lot of challenges and paradoxes that I will try to point out in terms of governance and long-term development as far as tourism is concerned. Now, what we tend to do, of course, is we're going to try to give you a context of tourism, development, and climate change, and so forth. So pre-pandemic, tourism was ranked the fourth largest economic sector. After fuels, chemicals, and food, it contributed 10.2% to global GDP. This fell, of course, during the pandemic, especially the beginning of the pandemic, about 5.2% in 2020. It's still one of the 5 top export earners in over 150 countries and the #1 export sector in over 60 countries. If you look at it on a geographic basis, or I should say more income classification, we have 33% of developing countries for whom tourism is the main source of foreign exchange, and 50% for least developed countries. So broadly speaking, though, tourism is, and this is really say international tourism, because this must be divorced from tourism where you can have domestic tourism. So international tourism is perceived as important by policymakers, certainly because of these things here. It's an avenue for economic specialization and certainly an improvement in economic and foreign exchange flows in our very open economies. Now, the UN World Tourism Organization, they have listed, I guess, there are several reasons why it's an especially suitable economic development sector for LDC. And I've listed them here. It is consumed at the point of production, and so the tourist has to go to the destination and spend their money there, which of course opens an opportunity for local businesses of all sorts, and allows local communities to benefit through the informal economy by selling business services to tourists. Number two, most LDCs have a comparative advantage in tourism over developed countries, and they tend to have various attributes that may lend themselves to tourism. Well, comparative advantage is not the same as competitive advantage. What we're saying is that they tend to have some natural attributes that basically permit them to have this comparative advantage, like weather, climate, and so forth. But sometimes there's other things. They could be natural history, heritage, the environment, and so forth. But certainly this is one of the reasons why LDCs have a comparative advantage in tourism. Tourism tends to be more diverse, it's an argument advance, it is labor intensive, and so this labor intensiveness tends to help it is argued, to tackle poverty. It also creates opportunities for many small and micro entrepreneurs, whether that be in formal and informal economies. So it's an industry that tends to have some, I would say, low startup costs or low barriers to entry. And so it perhaps can create these opportunities. It provides material benefits for the poor, but can also provide cultural pride. And the infrastructure required by tourism, and there's several of them there, transport, communications, water supply and sanitation, and so forth. These can also develop for tourism or touristic purposes, but naturally, these can, of course, also benefit local communities, poor, middle class, and upper class sections of the community. So these are some reasons why UNWTO argues that tourism is especially suited for less developed countries. Now, in relation to what I just said, though, or what UNWTO advances, the evidence of positive outcomes with respect to tourism and sustainability, terms including poverty reduction, biodiversity conservation, it is mixed. So we find some studies that suggest that the outcomes are good outcomes and some that don't. And certainly even among the ones that find that the outcomes are positive, these are perhaps overstated. Okay? We find that tourism tends to disproportionately benefit those that are already wealthy, and in fact, can enforce existing inequalities. And these things, these social and socioeconomic things, these matter for the types of issues we have in relation to impacts of climate change and extreme weather events and so forth. Because those that are poor tend to suffer disproportionately from the effects of climate change and extreme weather events like flooding. And another thing, as I'm talking about evidence that basically is in contradistinction to what we saw in the previous slide, tourism contributes substantially to resource consumption and global change. All right. In terms of the UNWTO position, I should point out though that they are not the only supranational organization that advances such views about the benefits of tourism to lesser developed countries. You have others like the World Travel and Tourism Council, the World Economic Forum, DFID, which is the British Department for International Development, the Canadian International Development Agency, CEDA, USAID, the American Development Bank. Many of those tend to have that view. right? But I mean, when you heard me list those types of agencies, certainly we understand them in the context of global political economy. These tend to have a certain view of how countries can lift themselves out of poverty, how we can become wealthier countries. Now, in tourism policy terms, let's say in terms of marry tourism, sustainable development, and climate change, context I'm building here, sustainability is primarily seen as environmental and development as economic, and to a lesser extent, the social aspect of sustainability. So this is how tourism policy tends to frame sustainable development. And what it intends to do is to mitigate the paradox between these relationships without, say, affecting existing economic relationships. So you want to have your cake and eat it. Basically, the idea is to grow tourism. Grow tourism basically tends to mean more tourists, more tourism infrastructure, and so forth. But at the same time, try to supposedly reduce the impacts that tourism causes within, especially local contexts. Now, at least I would say 2 primary reasons can be advanced as to why the sustainability of tourism is being questioned. Now, first, while tourism has been promoted in the development community for decades, the mid to long-term relative contribution of tourism to development strategies remains poorly evaluated, despite, of course, all such entreaties to the contrary. Now, there's been a greater interest by international development agencies in advocating tourism and initiating projects than in nationally critically assessing the consequences of tourism-related development strategies. Now, the second reason why sustainability of tourism is being questioned is embedded in the first reason again, which is that the paradigmatic and institutional context of tourism and sustainable development often makes it difficult to recognize other policy alternatives and priorities. And we see that in the Caribbean, so we see it in Barbados. When any attempts are made to question the prioritization of tourism, say in terms of our national economy, and I suspect this is the same across the Caribbean. It's like, others, they will ask, so what else? If not tourism, then what else? It's a lazy mindset, a lazy thinking. Of course, we are not any individual persons and say what is precisely the next thing or the best thing other than tourism. What we're trying to say is that we have to have a more critical view of placing so much resources into one sector. And we know, without a fact, that's in the Caribbean and other countries as well, even rich countries, how vulnerable tourism is to any sort of shock. It could be environmental, it could be financial, or otherwise. Tourism is a very discretionary activity, and so it is very susceptible to virtually any sort of shock that exists. And so when we ask these questions about sustainability tourism, it is not to say get rid of tourism, it's to say we must be more critical, understand what I'm saying here. So, yes, okay, so I'll go forward. I do want to say something else about this point about sustainability. However, now we find certainly when it comes to the rhetoric about balance, I mentioned how we tend tourism policy, these tourism organizations, even tourism policymakers in the region tend to speak about sustainability. There's balance about tourism becoming a cornerstone of a sustainable development policy and so forth. But we still find, though, that the growing contribution of tourism, especially in terms of its place in national economies, it raises a clear question as to certainly whether this balanced tourism or this green tourism is really achievable. And we find this contradiction, this paradox no more evident than in terms of its relationship to climate change. As I said, tourism contributes to and is affected by climate change. Now, here are some stats about tourism in terms of its contributions to emissions. So, sector, the group here, tourism, transport, accommodation, and activities combined to about an estimated 5% of global anthropogenic emissions of CO2. Transportation, of that 5%, transportation accounts for 75% of the sector's emissions, 2% from air transport, accommodation makes it 22% of that, the rest of activity related to tourism accounts for 4%. So this assessment I want to point out though does not include the impact of short-lived greenhouse gases. So a more accurate assessment that would include the impact of short-lived greenhouse gases would actually bring tourism's contribution. The range is about from 5.2 to 12.5% of all anthropogenic forces, and the best estimate is about 8%. Nonetheless, regardless of how it is measured, we can certainly recognize the contribution of tourism, particularly transportation, air transport, to greenhouse gas emissions, and naturally to the overall, how it contributes to overall climate change. On this slide, we have a number of studies that were done to demonstrate the impact. So, you know, the contribution of emissions from tourism is expected to grow substantially, both in absolute terms and relative to other economic sectors. And, you know, if travel and tourism remain on a business as usual path, then they're going to become an increasing source of greenhouse gas emissions, both in the medium term and in the long term. And in fact, even if the per capita per trip contribution of tourists to greenhouse gas emissions continues to fall because of greater efficiencies of technology, governance, and management innovations, the absolute contribution will grow because of increasing tourism mobility. More and more tourists are traveling, and the number is always expected to grow. That is what is happening. So, well, the per capita is falling, the volume overall is increasing, so the overall contribution of the sector, international tourism to greenhouse gas emissions, is still going to grow. Okay, so it means then, as an increasing share of the global carbon budget, tourism will be increasingly responsible for those greenhouse gas emissions. Now, I've said all that, and just to make this point, I'm going to get into some of the paradoxes, and well, some of them should be clear to you right now. It is fundamentally unclear to me how carbon neutral positions are to be achieved in scenarios posited by scientists. How can growth in tourism, particularly air travel, that is going to lead to continued increasing emissions, be reconciled with sustainable development? And I'm going to bring through paradoxes, I'm going to bring them home to the Caribbean. We know, we understand, we certainly appreciate, or not, unless you're a climate denier, climate change denier, that tourism continued growth at current rates will lead to absolute increases in CO2 emissions. One issue, the effects of climate change, we already know disproportionate effects the less wealthy countries. Even within countries, whether they're poor or rich, the benefits of tourism are not evenly distributed. Now, Caribbean countries, we understand, we see our leaders go to international fora and argue strongly about the disproportionate impacts of climate change on Caribbean countries and other small developing countries. We're the ones that we contribute the least to the problem, but we suffer disproportionately. Okay, but we know in the Caribbean as well that we are always promoting tourism development. We are always saying we want more tourists, more tourism infrastructure. There's hardly a day in the Caribbean context where tourism isn't mentioned in the press or in some contexts. It's always more tourism, we need more tourists, we need more hotels, we need more tourism, this and that. But how are you, I mean international tourists, international tourism, how are these tourists getting here? They're getting here by air travel, the component of international tourism that contributes the most to climate change that our leaders are seeing. We suffer from disproportion. It is a paradox. We want more tourists, but the way to bring them here is going to contribute to the very climate change that we're seeing affects us most disproportionately. It is a paradox. Now, if I try to now bring these things together, tourism, climate change, and the Caribbean, you know, our coastal marine ecosystems, these are intrinsically tied to the tourism sector. What I'm trying to do now is to take what I've said and now try to link it to the issue of flooding and related matters. So the coastal marine ecosystems in our region, these are intrinsically tied to the tourism sector. So we have, of course, the coral reefs, seagrass beds, mangroves, the beaches. We have other ecosystems that host the lagoons, tidal pools. We have species diversity in and around coastal marine sector, vertebrates, fish, and so forth. All of those form part of our coastal marine sector, as I said, which is intrinsically tied to tourism. The hotels, by and large, are on the coast, guest houses, and so forth. And certainly, even if they're not directly on the coast, they tend to be in, say, easy reach of those coastal and marine zones. Now, in terms of the coastal marine ecosystems, these are ones that are critically vulnerable to climate change. And of course, climate change, I'm telling this climate change to things that will lead to greater flooding events. So ecosystem services, I mean, these are services that these ecosystems can provide. So it could be coral reefs, for example, help to reduce the impact of the sea waves energy onto shorelines, which can cause coastal erosion and so forth. Naturally, the other services provided by other, let's say, organisms like I could say mangroves, for example. Mangroves are also part of that seashore protection and whatnot. Those face challenges associated with accelerated sea rise. Mentioning here the fish and shellfish populations, freshwater resources, and things flying by. Increased water concentration, ocean acidification, human settlements and well-being. I'll speak about that one in a second, a little bit more. Naturally, we find, of course, it's just level rise. And dealing with flooding, of course, flooding isn't just coming from precipitation. Sea level rise will lead to greater flood events. And you can have inundation of coastal areas, loss in coastal regions. And even moderate sea level rise can have large impacts for low-lying coastal zones and deltas. These can damage coastal infrastructure, forest industry, the built environment, agricultural areas. Erosion can lead to beachfront, cliff top, buildings and related infrastructure being damaged. I heard discussions about sea level intrusion and so forth. We have displacement or location of human populations. Of course, this can also lead to adverse effects on human health. The release of flooding events can lead to release of toxins from landfills and waste sites. There's, of course, the mental health problems that can be triggered by floods and flood events. And so there's a whole spillover of these impacts. And as I'm saying, we focus on the coastal marine zone, which is, I'm saying, tied to tourism sectors in our countries. But we recognize again, the paradoxes, because these are things that tend to take place when the degree of tourism dependence is so high. And so all of the infrastructure, the built infrastructure, especially on coastal marine zones affected by climate change and climate change related events. And so we have to, as we continue to think about tourism development in our countries, we have to be increasingly mindful again of the issues and the spillover of increase or growth in tourism. So these things here, but I don't get these kind of recommendations now, which are tied to, as I said, the infrastructures that may be useful on the tourism, coastline zone, marine zone. But certainly the discussion here, once we start talking about what can we do to prevent certain events or, and concept climate change is also adaptation and mitigation. The mitigation tends to be at a global scale because the point there is to try to reduce the degree or the amount of greenhouse gases. Well, so we already recognize in the Caribbean we're very small contributors to the problem. So I would say, even as of course we will still do things, but I think our focus will ought to be adaptation and less on mitigation. And I've heard, because these things then of course come with costs, and we need of course the financial support to basically adopt a lot of these things. So adaptation, yes, can happen at a global scale, but it can also, for sure, you can do things at a local scale that can result in spillovers across national boundaries. So the emphasis I would recommend for the Caribbean when it comes to how to deal with climate change events. Focus on this panel today before flooding, but flooding, not only precipitation, both on the coast and the marine zone, so the sea level rise, but of course also runoff if there's a lot of precipitation. And so it's either the flooding can come as a result of sea level rise enhancing the effects. Of course, it can happen where you have flooding on land and it runs off to the sea. So adaptation, though, is really what I would recommend for us in the Caribbean landscape. And so this is a summary of what I just saw very quickly. Some of you say, well, I'm not an engineer, but certainly, you see some retreats that are planned. Move in, you can accommodate. That's the slide this position. You raise the house so that any sea level rise or so flooding that is enhanced by sea level rise. That allows or accommodates that type of flooding. You can have forest structures and so that, so you can have seawalls and other abutments and so forth. Apart from that, though, some measures for us in the Caribbean. We have natural mangroves and natural breakwaters. Unfortunately, in terms of tourism development on our coast, basically removed a lot of the mangroves that were there. Mangroves tended to be previously looked at certainly as just kind of muddy, mucky. These trees are close to the shoreline and don't look very attractive, perhaps, but they have a very important service to the coastal zone there. Hatcheries, nurseries for young fish, and so forth. But they said they also have that they offer protection to the coastal zone, especially the areas that perhaps like beaches and so forth, by reducing the impact of the wave energy in terms of erosion and so forth. But mangroves are natural breakwaters, so rehabilitation, reforestation coastlines should be a part of any adaptation that Caribbean countries do. In terms of our policies, perhaps flood zone designations we modified to incorporate expectancy level rates. Okay, things like setbacks, reducing development in hazardous coastal areas. I'm saying, however, notwithstanding this type of approach, retreating inland will be unavoidable ultimately. Other I would say other things that we can do, which are not necessarily engineering things, but certainly monitoring of coastal waters for other things like beach events and other marine events. Try to rehabilitate certain ecosystems like fish habitats and so forth. Development of national evacuation and rescue plans for extreme weather events. These are things that we have to consider. Like this tourism. Now, this one here now, it comes the other way. Let's try to think outside the box. Only just thinking, I saw a lot of what was done here today, focus really on flooding within the country and perhaps what we do. Remember, I'm trying to marry tourism, climate change, sustainable development, tourism, and flooding. But we understand how climate change is impacted by tourism, and then how that climate change or extreme events can impact, say, coastal marine zones is tied to the tourism sector. So tourism impacts the coastal marine zone through its contribution to greenhouse gas emissions and ultimately climate change. And we have these extreme weather events like flooding. Now here, I'm saying, let's say now for local economies or countries, the impact comes the other way. So in another country, there are going to be extreme weather events like flooding, right? No, it's not happening here, perhaps, but we can still be affected. How do we adapt to this type of events in other countries? So I mentioned here air travel associated with spread of waterborne and other diseases, right? So if we can have these flood events in other countries, you will find, and we know certainly, especially in the last 2 years, we're very aware that diseases travel on the plane, right? How did COVID get to the Caribbean? It didn't start here. It was brought here by air travel. If you consider waterborne disease like dengue and other things, this is how we could be impacted by flood events happening other places because we're so dependent on tourism, especially international tourism. Okay, so how can we adapt? I just mentioned a few things here. We may have to continue to do these things, even as we are seeing we're coming out of COVID, and a lot of the things that we're doing will probably, I don't know if they will be completely stop, but fever screening programs at airports for early detection of febrile passengers among quarantine facilities. We know how to listen to the Caribbean now, we've been doing it for pretty much 2 years. You may have to continue to maintain that, even as it's not just like COVID. Another way in which we can adapt, and this is a study that was shared with me, surveillance and wastewater from aircraft as an effective tool for informing management of returning overseas passengers and so forth, and for monitoring the implications of clinically significant pathogens. So this is the wastewater effluents, go to the toilet. That's what we're talking about here with wastewater, and also the water that persons use to wash their hands. All of that can be tested to see whether there is any passenger on that plane, perhaps has any sort of significant pathogen that you may need to try and isolate and quarantine that person. So these are the ways in which tourism is impacted by and itself contributes to climate change and ultimately these sort of flood events and so forth. And there's ways in which we have to adapt. The reality in the Caribbean, certainly those that tourists, this is something that our policymakers have to aware of. Tourists have the greatest capacity to adapt to the impact of climate change because they can simply avoid places that are affected. Okay, so this is why it's important for us to manage our own environment context of tourism, but also keep an eye on what's happening elsewhere. Let's just not just any number of tourists come here without basically, putting in place mechanisms to continuously screen against the sort of things we're seeing. I was speaking to Dr. Douglas early this summer, and it seemed to me, I told him that every other week there was some new outbreak of something somewhere. There was monkeypox, there was some other disease, I don't remember what it is now, in India. It seemed, and I've just heard again, there's been some outbreak of Ebola in an African country. And so this is a reality when you are a tourism-dependent country with a tourism-dependent region. You have to constantly be on guard in relation to the way in which these things can reach your shores. Okay, and despite the rhetoric of sustainability from our policymakers, they still will all pursue pro-growth paradigms when it comes to tourism. And you know how it works. Annual visitor growth is considered the indicator of success, notwithstanding the fact that this increased visitor growth across the region contributes to greenhouse gas emissions. And remember what I'm saying, they are all at international forum, rightly so, speaking about the disproportionate impacts of climate change in our countries. So I'll wrap up. So adapting to climate change is ultimately going to require more systematic integration of governance strategies, science, regulatory systems, policy, and economics at an international level to be effective to right those of the impacts that are projected for the Caribbean. Okay, so this integration will involve more subtle changes in our culture, institutional culture, particularly channel of communication, our modes of interaction, and that will continue to build trust on governments, government agencies, and stakeholders, which include citizens. So thank you, and I'll turn it back over to Dr. Douglas.
Thank you very much, Professor Lord. And I think to summarize with this webinar, I really want to thank all the presenters for presenting on climate change and sustainable development, yes, but from their perspective and vantage point, because I think it's quite important to understand, to tackle these types of issues successfully, that is, it will require a very multi-pronged approach. Persons from different disciplines, different professions, different ways of thinking to kind of integrate all of these different experiences, all of this different expertise in fashioning effective and sustainable solutions. Professor Troy Lord, he would have mentioned in terms of tourism And within biosecurity, within the theory, there are 4 major vulnerabilities, the pun on the T's. Tourism is one key one, transport, trade, and travel. So this is how, within the context of biosecurity, all of these things coalesce and merge to form what we would consider a challenge for biosecurity, because you have to include, like what we would have mentioned with Ms. Agong, transportation, engineers, transportation planning, because when there's flooding, the immediate concern or one of the immediate challenges is how do you have, or do you mobilize people from one area that might be of risk to an area that is of lower risk. Then in terms of the drainage with Mr. Yearwood, what are we, in terms of what plans have we had in place prior to the actual flood event that can mitigate or reduce the negative impacts of flooding? And this also requires a whole of government effort in terms of the Ministry of Economics, ensuring that the departments are adequately funded to carry out the type of maintenance that is necessary to keep all of the existing infrastructure in high working order, and also in terms of the persons in BWA in the context of Barbados, the Water Authority, ensuring that water quality isn't impacted, the Department of Emergency Management, the Ministry of Health, the Ministry of Education, because kids are at school, and when there's flooding, obviously, you know, schools close, and then there's APB that's going out to all the parents, oh, come and collect your children, and that creates then a traffic jam. So there are lots of radiating issues that occur due to one singular climate impact, but there are so many different agencies, so many different organizations that are involved. And that's why at the center, we are espousing an approach that is one life. So whatever you experience in life, it never really is what you will encounter in one singular discipline. You will encounter a myriad of interconnected persons, interconnected professions. And that is really at the crux of biosecurity. And at first, it's difficult for people to kind of understand it because it's a real systematic approach. It's the integration of systems thinking, and systems approach to risk. How can you do that? And it involves very strong communication. You have to be able to communicate to different people in different ways. This is either professionally or even in terms of the population as well. And so I want to really thank those presenters, and I hope this gives the persons who would have joined us, and I thank you also in the audience for joining us and for staying the course. We do have another webinar that is being planned at the moment, and this will be part 2 from the climate change and sustainable development. And I will just give you a brief preview in terms of what that looks like. Sorry. This is what it looks like here. So we will be actually looking at the impact of climate change, and in particular flooding, but this time we will have a more narrow focus in terms of healthcare. So we'll be looking at, okay, when you do have a flooding impact, what does this mean in terms of the impact on the healthcare system, on the emergency management system? So we have Mr. Michael Clark. He was a former employee at RAB Consultants, but he is head of the business continuity, emergency management, and disaster risk resilience at the National Health Service in the UK. We have Ms. Kerry Hines, she's the director of the Department of Emergency Management. And we have our own Dr. Isabel Guerin. She is the climatologist, and she actually conducted a recent study on, and this is something that I read with quite great interest, in terms of how the Caribbean wet season is now extending. So prior, I think of maybe 20 years ago, the hurricane season typically was from June to October, maybe November. But usually October, that's what the dogma was. But what we're seeing is that that is no longer the case. And usually the peak of the rainy season is in September and October, which is really the quote unquote end of the hurricane season. But we're seeing heavy rainfall in November and also December. So Dr. Isabel will be able to provide a bit more context where that is concerned, because I think in terms of flood risk management, that is going to be absolutely critical. And also in terms of the impacts of the ENSO cycle, La Nina and El Nino, and how those impact on what we would consider risk management right across the board, from tourism to drainage to emergency management planning, infrastructural works and infrastructural planning. I know that the government of Barbados is now embarking on infrastructural works in the eastern part of the island, a major roadworks plan and also a project. And one is hopeful that this particular thinking in terms of climate change and the role of adaptation in mitigating the deleterious impact on road infrastructure, because that's something that could also be compromised. We've seen it, I think, in Guadeloupe, in some of the pictures after the passage of the hurricane there, where an entire road bridge is taken out. And that means in terms of transport planning, how that sometimes, persons may be secluded or cut off or isolated from the rest of the country until that is restored. And all of these are contingency plans that have to be in place before that actually occurs. And then we have also from CARFA, Miss Dr. Lisa Indar, and she's the Director of Surveillance, Disease Prevention and Control at CARFA. And she will also be looking at that, because tourism plays a major role in the Caribbean. So we can't speak about sustainable development without speaking about tourism. And so this is what we have, and this will be scheduled for in November. So the end of November, we'll have that. And coming up next month, we have a lecture that will be given, and it will be examining the interplay between infectious diseases and chronic non-communicable diseases. I think we've seen it quite vividly with COVID-19, but there are other diseases which are actually, some of them are endemic in the Caribbean, that also have a very strong linkage with chronic non-communicable diseases. And so we will have a lecturer from Holland, and he will be given that lecture in October, and we will disseminate the information on that quite soon, once we've actually nailed down a specific date and time for that lecture, but that will likely be coming on to the end of October, and we will send out the necessary communication. So I really want to thank all of you. Thank you for staying the course. And before you leave, could you kindly just finish the second poll that we issued? Sorry, I didn't give the announcement, but some of you had already started to fill out the poll. And these polls are important as we collect data on persons who attend our webinar series, because we want to make it more informative, more engaging. We know the time is short, but we try to cram a lot in a very small time, because we want it to be exciting, we want it to be fluid and informative. So I really want to thank you, and take care and have a great afternoon. And please do stay safe and stay tuned to what the center will also be sending out. So take care and have a great afternoon, and good night to our colleagues in the UK as well. Thank you. Bye-bye.